He buys a ranch for $20, then discovers a white girl suspended inside the barn. Daniel Harper never believed that life could change because of $20. To him, $20 was barely enough for a decent meal in the city. It was not the kind of money that could buy land, let alone an entire ranch. But one quiet Thursday afternoon, while scrolling through an online county auction list, he saw something that made him sit up straight in his chair. Abandoned ranch property. Minimum bid, $20. At first, he laughed. He assumed it was a typing mistake. Maybe $2,000. Maybe $20,000. But 20? That made no sense. Daniel clicked on the listing. The photos loaded slowly. The first image showed a wide stretch of dry land under a pale sky. The grass looked yellow and tired. The second photo showed a small farmhouse with faded white paint and a porch that leaned slightly to one side. The last image showed a large wooden barn standing a short distance away from the house. The barn looked old, but strangely stronger than the rest of the buildings. He read the description carefully. The property had been seized due to unpaid taxes. It had been empty for years. The county wanted it gone. That was all. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. For months he had been thinking about leaving the city. The noise, the crowded streets, the constant rush, it had drained him. His job in a small marketing company felt like a wheel that never stopped turning. Every day felt the same. Wake up, work, come home tired, repeat. He wanted something different, something quiet. Still, $20 felt suspicious. Nothing in life came that cheap without a reason. That evening he mentioned it to his coworker Mark during their break. A ranch for $20, Mark said, raising an eyebrow. That's not a deal. That's a warning. Maybe it's just land nobody wants. Exactly, Mark replied. Ask yourself why nobody wants it. The next morning, instead of going straight to work, Daniel called the county office listed in the auction details. A tired-sounding woman answered. Yes, the property is available, she confirmed. It has been through several auctions already. No buyers. Is there something wrong with it? Daniel asked carefully. There was a pause on the line. It's just old, she said. Remote location. Needs repairs. That was not really an answer, but it wasn't a clear warning either. Daniel checked the map. The ranch was about 4 hours away from the city, near a small town he had never heard of. The town looked tiny. Just a few roads crossing each other like lines drawn on dusty paper. By lunchtime, Daniel had made a decision that surprised even himself. He placed the minimum bid online. $20. He expected someone else to jump in and outbid him, but no one did. 3 days later, he received confirmation. The ranch was his. It felt unreal. He kept rereading the email as if it might disappear. That weekend, Daniel packed a small bag, filled his car with gas, and started the long drive out of the city. The tall buildings slowly disappeared behind him. The highways turned into smaller roads. The small roads turned into long, empty stretches surrounded by fields and open sky. The farther he drove, the quieter it became. By the time he reached the small town near the ranch, the sun was beginning to lower. The town looked almost frozen in time. There was one gas station, a grocery store, and a diner with a flickering sign. Daniel stopped at the gas station to ask for directions. An older man behind the counter looked at him with curiosity. You're not from around here, the man said. No, Daniel replied with a polite smile. I just bought some property nearby, an old ranch. The man's expression changed slightly. Which ranch? Daniel gave the address. For a brief moment, the gas station felt even quieter than before. The man blinked slowly. That place? He said. Didn't know anyone was crazy enough to buy it. Daniel laughed nervously. Why? Is it falling apart? The man didn't laugh. Just been empty a long time. Anything else I should know? The man hesitated. Then he shook his head. Just be careful out there. It gets lonely. Lonely. Daniel thanked him and returned to his car. As he drove away, he noticed the man still watching from the doorway. The road to the ranch was narrow and cracked. Dry grass stretched endlessly on both sides. No houses. No neighbors. Just open land and a wide sky that seemed to press down on everything. Finally, he saw it. The farmhouse stood in the distance, small against the land. The paint had peeled away in many places. The windows were dusty. The porch steps sagged slightly in the middle, but it was standing. And behind it, like a silent guard, stood the barn. The barn was larger than he expected. Its wooden walls were dark but solid. The roof looked newer than the house's roof. The big double doors were shut tight. Daniel parked his car and stepped out. The air felt different there. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier somehow. Even the wind seemed slower, as if it moved carefully around the buildings. He walked toward the house first. The front door creaked loudly when he pushed it open. Dust covered almost every surface. The living room was small but still had an old wooden table in the corner. A staircase led upstairs. The air smelled stale but not rotten. It's not that bad, Daniel whispered to himself. He moved from room to room. Everything looked frozen in time, as if the last owner had simply walked out one day and never returned. A cup still sat on the kitchen counter. A chair was slightly pulled out from the dining table. But there were no personal photos, no clothes, nothing that made the place feel truly lived in. After exploring the house, Daniel stepped back outside. The sky had turned orange and pink as the sun began to set. He turned his attention to the barn. From a distance, it looked ordinary, but as he walked closer, he noticed something unusual. Barn doors were not just closed. They were secured with thick, rusted chains, the metal wrapped tightly around the handles, as if someone had wanted to make sure no one entered. Daniel frowned. If the ranch had been abandoned for years, why lock the barn so carefully? He reached out and touched the chain. It was rough and cold. The lock itself looked old, but strong. A small chill ran through him. It's probably just old equipment inside, he told himself. Maybe something valuable. The sun was nearly gone, and the land felt darker than it should have. Instead, he walked around the barn slowly. The wooden walls had only a few small windows, and most of them were covered from the inside. That struck him as strange. Why board up windows from the inside? As he circled back to the front, the wind suddenly picked up. The barn let out a low creaking sound like a long sigh. Daniel stood still. For a brief second, he had the strange feeling that he was not alone. Not that someone was standing behind him, but that the land itself was watching. He shook off the thought. He was tired from the drive. His imagination was playing tricks on him. He returned to the house, locked the door behind him, and set up a small sleeping bag in the living room. There was no electricity yet, so he used a flashlight to look around one last time before lying down. The silence was unlike anything he had ever experienced. In the city, there was always noise, cars, voices, distant sirens. Here, there was nothing, just the soft sound of wind brushing against wood. As he stared at the ceiling, Daniel thought about how strange life was. 1 week ago, he had been sitting in an office cubicle. Now he owned a ranch in the middle of nowhere. He should have felt excited. Instead, he felt something he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like anticipation, like the land was holding a secret. And somehow, without knowing why, Daniel felt that buying the ranch for $20 was not an accident. It was the beginning of something. Outside, the barn stood silent in the darkness, its chained doors unmoving. Daniel woke up early the next morning, long before the sun fully rose. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. The ceiling above him looked unfamiliar, and the air felt too still. Then he remembered. The ranch. The empty land. The quiet town. The heavy silence. He sat up slowly and listened. Nothing. No traffic. No neighbors. No distant sounds. Just wind moving softly outside. He stepped onto the wooden floor, which creaked under his weight. The sound echoed more than it should have in such a small house. It reminded him again how alone he was out there. After washing his face with bottled water, he walked outside. The morning light spread across the land like a pale blanket. From this angle, the ranch looked almost peaceful. The farmhouse, though old, seemed harmless in daylight. Then his eyes moved to the barn. It stood there, large and still, as if it had been waiting for him to wake up. The thick chain around its doors caught the sunlight. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the metal glint slightly. The sight made him feel curious again. He told himself there was nothing strange about a locked barn. Maybe the previous owner had stored tools inside. Maybe the county had secured it after taking over the property. Still, something about the chain felt too intentional. Daniel grabbed a small toolbox from his car. He had packed basic tools, thinking he might need them for simple repairs. He walked toward the barn slowly, each step crunching against the dry ground. As he got closer, he noticed more details. The wood on the barn was weathered but solid. The roof looked newer than the house roof, as if it had been repaired more recently. That confused him. If the property had been abandoned for years, who had fixed the roof? He pushed the thought aside. Standing directly in front of the doors, Daniel studied the chain carefully. It was wrapped tightly several times around the handles. The lock itself was thick and rusty, but not completely worn out. Touched it again. Cold. For a moment he hesitated. Once he opened those doors, whatever was inside would no longer be a mystery. He would know. And somehow the unknown felt safer. He shook his head at himself. He was being dramatic. With a deep breath, Daniel placed his tools on the ground and began working on the lock. It wasn't easy. The metal resisted him. His hands slipped more than once. Sweat formed on his forehead even though the morning air was cool. Nearly 40 minutes passed before he finally heard a sharp snap. The lock broke. The chain loosened and fell against the wooden doors with a loud clatter. The sound echoed across the empty land, making Daniel jump slightly. He stood still and listened again. Still nothing. Slowly, he pushed the barn doors open. They moved with a long, heavy creak, like a sound that had not been heard in years. Dust rose into the air as sunlight slipped inside through the widening gap. At first, he could barely see anything. The inside was darker than he expected. The windows were covered from the inside with wooden boards, blocking most of the light. Why would someone board them up from inside? He wondered. He stepped forward cautiously. The smell inside was not rotten or spoiled. It was simply old, like dry wood and dust that had settled for a very long time. As his eyes adjusted, shapes began to form in the dim light. Old farming tools leaned against the walls. Empty wooden crates were stacked in one corner. A ladder lay on its side. Everything looked... Daniel walked deeper inside. His footsteps stirred dust on the ground, leaving clear marks behind him. The silence inside the barn felt heavier than outside. Even the air seemed thicker. Then he noticed something unusual above him. At first, it was just a shape hanging from the ceiling beams. He squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing. A rope, but not like the kind used casually for farm work. This rope was clean, strong. It did not look as old as everything else around it. His heart began to beat faster. He took another step forward and looked more carefully. The rope wasn't just hanging loosely. It was connected to a pulley system attached high up in the beams. The system looked carefully assembled, almost engineered. Daniel's breathing slowed as confusion replaced curiosity. Who would build something like that? He moved closer. That was when he saw her. A young white girl was suspended in midair by a secure harness attached to the pulley system. She was not hanging loosely. The harness held her upright in a supported position, as if someone had carefully placed her there. For a moment, Daniel's mind refused to understand what his eyes were seeing. He blinked. She was very still. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He forced himself to breathe and stepped closer. "Hello?" he called softly, his voice echoing in the large space. No response. He felt fear rising inside him, but he pushed it down. He needed to think clearly. He moved around her slowly, trying to understand the setup. The ropes were tightly secured. The pulleys were attached with metal brackets. This was not random. Someone had planned this carefully. He looked at her face. She looked young, maybe in her early teens. Her eyes were closed. Her expression was calm, almost peaceful, but her stillness was unsettling. "Hey," Daniel said again, louder this time. "Can you hear me?" He stepped even closer and noticed something that made his chest tighten. She was breathing. Very lightly, but breathing. Relief and shock hit him at the same time. She was alive. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he examined the pulley system. He needed to lower her safely. He had never handled something like this before, but the mechanism seemed simple enough. It was designed to move smoothly. He carefully pulled the rope attached to the side, and slowly, gently, the system responded. The pulleys turned quietly. The girl began to descend inch by inch. Daniel kept his eyes on her the entire time, afraid something might go wrong. He quickly supported her weight and removed the harness straps as gently as he could. She felt light and weak, as if she had not eaten properly in days. He laid her carefully on the dusty barn floor and checked her breathing again, still steady. His mind raced with questions. How long had she been there? Who put her there? How could this happen on a property that had just been transferred to him? His hands moved quickly as he reached for his phone. The signal was weak but present. He called emergency services. He gave them the address, repeating it twice to make sure they understood. "They're on the way," the operator assured him. Daniel stayed beside the girl, speaking softly even though she did not respond. "It's okay," he said. "Help is coming." Minutes felt like hours. The barn, which had seemed empty and silent before, now felt like the center of something far bigger than him. He looked around again. There were no fresh footprints in the dust except his own. No food containers. No water bottles. No signs that someone had recently stayed there, yet she had clearly not been there for years. The rope looked new. The harness looked modern. None of it made sense. In the distance, he finally heard sirens. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with a deep, growing unease. As emergency workers rushed into the barn, Daniel stepped back, watching them carefully lift the girl onto a stretcher. They asked him questions, but he could barely answer clearly. His mind kept replaying the image of her suspended in the air. When they carried her outside into the bright daylight, Daniel followed slowly. The wide-open land that had seemed peaceful yesterday now felt different. It no longer felt lonely. It felt watched. As the ambulance doors closed and drove away, Daniel stood alone again in front of the barn. The broken chain lay at his feet. He looked back inside at the empty pulley system hanging from the ceiling beams. The barn was silent once more. But now Daniel understood something clearly. The ranch had not been empty, and whatever had happened there had happened recently. The flashing lights from the emergency vehicles faded into the distance, leaving Daniel standing alone in front of the barn once again. The morning sun was higher now, but the warmth did nothing to calm the uneasy feeling growing inside him. Only 24 hours ago, he had thought he was starting a peaceful new life. Now, police officers were walking across his land, taking pictures, writing notes, and asking serious questions. 2 officers approached him near the farmhouse. One of them, a tall woman with calm eyes, held a small notebook. "Sir, can you tell us again when you arrived at the property?" she asked gently. "Yesterday evening," Daniel replied. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "I stayed inside the house overnight. This morning I opened the barn for the first time." "You had never entered the barn before today?" "No," he said firmly. "The doors were chained. I had to break the lock." The officers exchanged a glance but said nothing. They walked toward the barn together. Daniel followed a few steps behind, watching as investigators carefully examined the pulley system still hanging from the ceiling. Photographs were taken from every angle. One officer even climbed a ladder to inspect the metal brackets attached to the wooden beams. "It's not old," the officer said from above. "The metal is clean. Installed recently." Daniel's stomach tightened. Recently. That meant someone had been there not long before he arrived. But how? He had seen no cars, no neighbors, no movement. The dust on the floor still showed only his footprints and the marks from the stretcher. An investigator crouched near the ground. "There are no other clear prints," he said. "Strange." Nothing about this made sense. The land had looked abandoned. The town felt almost empty. Yet someone had carefully built that system inside the barn and placed the girl there. A few hours later, one of the officers approached him again. "The girl is stable," she said. "She's at the hospital now." Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Is she awake?" "But the doctors believe she will recover." Relief washed over him, but it was followed quickly by another wave of worry. When she wakes up, what will she say? By late afternoon, the investigators left temporarily, promising to return the next day. They advised Daniel not to leave town and not to touch anything inside the barn. As the vehicles drove away, the ranch returned to silence once more. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring at the barn doors, now open and unchained. He had wanted a quiet life. That evening, he decided to drive into town. He needed answers. Maybe someone knew something about the property. The small diner near the gas station was half full when he walked in. Conversations grew quieter for a moment as people noticed him. News traveled fast in small towns. He ordered coffee and sat at the counter. After a few minutes, the same older man from the gas station entered and took a seat beside him. "You're the new ranch owner," the man said calmly. Daniel nodded. "I found someone inside the barn this morning." "I heard." Daniel studied the man's face carefully. "Did you know anything about that place?" The man took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "That ranch has been empty for years. People stopped going near it." "Why?" "Stories. Old ones." "What kind of stories?" "The previous owner disappeared a long time ago. No one ever found out what happened. After that, the property passed through different hands, but no one stayed long." "Disappeared how?" "No one knows. Just gone one day." Daniel leaned back. "But that doesn't explain what happened now." "No, it doesn't. That was the most frustrating part. The past might have been strange, but this was something recent. Real. A girl had been inside that barn just hours before he opened it." Daniel finished his coffee and returned to the ranch before dark. As he drove up, the land looked peaceful again, almost innocent. Too innocent. Inside the house, he tried to rest, but his mind refused to settle. Every small creak of wood made him sit up. Every gust of wind sounded louder than before. Sometime after midnight, his phone rang. The sudden sound made his heart jump. It was one of the officers. "She's awake," the officer said. Daniel sat up straight. Is she okay? She's weak but stable. We asked her some basic questions, and? There was a short pause. She said something unusual. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. What did she say? She said the man who put her in the barn was the owner of the ranch. Daniel felt like the air had been knocked out of him. What? That's not possible, he said quickly. I just bought the property. I've only been there one night. I understand, the officer replied calmly. Records confirm that, but that's what she said. Daniel stood up and began pacing the room. Did she describe him? She said he looked like you. Silence filled the space between them. Like me? Daniel repeated quietly. Yes. Of similar height, similar face, but older. Daniel's mind struggled to process it. That doesn't make sense, he whispered. We're not accusing you, the officer assured him. We're just telling you what she reported. Memory can be confused after stress. We'll talk to her again tomorrow. After the call ended, Daniel stood in the dark living room staring at nothing. An older version of him? That was impossible. He had never been to this ranch before buying it. They had no connection to this town, at least none that he knew of. Sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning, investigators returned, this time focusing on the house. They searched every room carefully. Inside a hallway closet, one officer discovered something surprising. An old wooden trunk. It was covered in dust, pushed far into the corner as if forgotten. Was this here when you arrived? The officer asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. I didn't open that closet. They carried the trunk into the living room and carefully opened it. Inside were old photographs, documents, and faded papers. Most of them looked decades old. One photograph caught Daniel's attention immediately. It showed a man standing in front of the same barn. The man looked strikingly familiar. Daniel felt his breath catch. The face in the photo had the same eyes, the same jawline, the same shape of nose, but the hair was gray. The skin slightly wrinkled with age. It looked like Daniel, just much older. Who is this? The officer asked. Daniel stared at the photo, confusion swirling inside him. I don't know, he said honestly. They turned the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, were 2 words. Thomas Harper. Daniel's last name. His heart pounded again. Harper. That's my last name, he whispered. Was this a relative? The officer asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. I don't think so. I don't know anyone from this area. But doubt had already begun to grow in his mind. Later that afternoon, Daniel called his mother. Mom, he said carefully, did we ever have family who lived out in the countryside? Somewhere far from the city? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Why are you asking? She said quietly. Just curious? Another pause. Your grandfather had a brother, she said slowly. Thomas. He moved away many years ago. The family lost contact with him. Daniel felt the room spin slightly. What happened to him? No one really knows, she replied. He just disappeared from our lives. An older man who looked like him. The same last name. A ranch with a strange history. And a girl who claimed the owner had placed her in the barn. The puzzle pieces did not fit together clearly yet, but they were beginning to form a picture that made Daniel question whether buying that ranch had truly been random. As the sun began to set again, casting long shadows across the land, Daniel stood at the barn entrance. The pulley system still hung from the ceiling, silent and still. He looked up at it, then back at the open field stretching endlessly beyond. Somewhere in that wide, empty land was a truth, and it felt closer than he wanted it to be. The discovery of the old photograph changed everything for Daniel. What had started as a strange accident now felt personal. The name written on the back of the photo, Thomas Harper, echoed in his mind again and again. Harper. He barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of the older man standing in front of the barn. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. It was not just similar. It was almost identical, as if someone had taken Daniel's face and aged it by 40 years. The next morning, investigators returned with more questions. This time, their tone was more serious, though still respectful. We looked into property records, one officer said. The ranch was originally owned by a Thomas Harper about 35 years ago. Daniel swallowed slowly. That matches the name on the photograph. Yes, the officer replied. He purchased the land in the late 1980s, lived here alone for several years. Then, suddenly, he vanished. Vanished how? Daniel asked. No official report. No confirmed explanation. Some say he left town quietly, others say he simply disappeared. After that, the property was sold through different hands over the years, but no one stayed long. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to process the information. Did he have family? Daniel asked carefully. No records of a wife or children living here, the officer said. But we're still checking older files. The officers then shifted their focus back to the barn. A specialist arrived to examine the pulley system more closely. He carefully removed one of the metal brackets and studied it. This was installed recently, the specialist confirmed. The screws are new. The wood around them shows fresh marks. Someone worked here not long ago. Daniel's heart beat faster. If the property was empty, how did someone get in? He asked. The officer looked at him. That's what we're trying to understand. The chain on the barn doors had been old, but it was possible someone had a key before the property changed hands, or maybe there had been another way in. Investigators searched around the outside of the barn again. This time, they walked farther into the fields. Near a group of trees about 50 meters away, one of them found tire tracks that were faint but still visible in the dry soil. They're not yours, the officer said after comparing them with Daniel's car. Daniel felt a small wave of relief. At least there was proof that someone else had been there. The tracks were partially faded as if made a few days earlier, not old enough to be from years ago, not new enough to have happened that morning. Someone had visited the ranch shortly before Daniel arrived. Later that afternoon, Daniel received another call from the hospital. The girl, Emily, was stronger now. She had been able to answer more questions clearly. Daniel drove to the hospital, unsure whether he was allowed to see her, but feeling that he needed to understand what was happening. When he arrived, an officer met him in the hallway. She remembers more now, the officer said quietly. And? Daniel asked. She said the man who brought her to the barn spoke calmly. He didn't shout. He told her not to be afraid. She said he looked like you, but older. Gray hair. Same eyes. Daniel felt his chest tighten again. Did she say his name? He asked. She said she never heard him say it. Can I see her? The officer hesitated, then agreed. Emily looked small in the hospital bed. Her face was pale but alert. When she saw Daniel enter, her eyes widened slightly. He stopped a few steps away, not wanting to frighten her. It's okay, the officer beside him said gently. This is the man who found you. Daniel could see confusion in her expression. He looks like him, she said softly, but younger. Daniel forced a calm smile. I just bought that ranch, he said gently. I've never been there before yesterday. She nodded slowly, as if trying to separate the two faces in her mind. The other man had gray hair, she said, but his voice sounded like yours. Daniel felt a strange mix of fear and disbelief. How could that be possible? After leaving the hospital, Daniel sat in his car for a long time without starting the engine. An older man who looked exactly like him, a relative who once owned the ranch and disappeared. Fresh tire tracks on the land. A newly built system inside the barn. None of it pointed clearly in one direction, but it all connected in uncomfortable ways. That evening, Daniel returned to the ranch with a new determination. If Thomas Harper had lived there for years, there had to be more traces left behind. He began searching the house more carefully than before. Behind loose boards, under old rugs, inside drawers that looked empty at first glance. In the upstairs bedroom, he noticed something unusual about the wall near the closet. The paint looked slightly uneven, as if it had been touched up at some point. He pressed gently against the wall. It felt hollow. His heart began to race again. Using a small tool, he carefully loosened part of the panel. It came away easier than expected, revealing a narrow, hidden space between the walls. Inside were old papers wrapped in cloth. Daniel pulled them out carefully and sat on the dusty floor to read them. Most of the pages were handwritten notes. Some described repairs to the barn. Others mentioned isolation and long stretches of silence. One line caught his attention. The land remembers everything. Daniel read it twice. Another note described plans for modifying the barn beams. Sketches of pulleys and support systems were drawn in careful detail. His hands trembled slightly. These drawings looked similar to the system investigators had removed. But the notes were old. Decades old. Was someone continuing Thomas Harper's work? Or had Thomas never truly left? Daniel shook his head at the thought. That was impossible. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone found the old notes and decided to copy the design. Maybe someone related to Thomas had returned quietly? The wind outside grew stronger, making the house creak softly. Daniel carefully placed the papers back into the cloth and hid them in his bag. He needed to show them to the investigators in the morning. As night fell again, Daniel stood outside between the house and the barn. The sky was clear, filled with stars brighter than any he had seen in the city. The ranch looked peaceful under the moonlight. But peace was only an illusion. Somewhere in the past, Thomas Harper had lived here alone. He had designed strange systems inside the barn. Then he had disappeared without explanation. Now, decades later, someone who looked like him had returned. Or at least, someone who looked like Daniel. The thought made his stomach tighten. Was it possible that someone in his extended family knew about this place and had kept it a secret? Or was someone deliberately using the family resemblance to confuse everything? Daniel walked slowly toward the barn once more. The doors were open now, no longer chained. He stepped inside. Without the pulley system hanging from the ceiling, the space felt emptier. But the beams still showed fresh marks where the brackets had been installed. He looked up at them, imagining the careful hands that had worked there. Whoever built that system knew what they were doing. And they knew this ranch. A sudden realization hit him. If someone had been using the property before he bought it, they might not know it had changed owners yet. They might think it was still abandoned. Daniel felt a quiet but growing sense of urgency. If the person responsible believed the ranch was empty, they could return. And next time, Daniel might not be simply an observer. He stepped back outside and locked the house carefully. For the first time since arriving, he felt truly alert, as if every sound carried meaning. The mystery was no longer just about a cheap property. It was about family history, about a name, about a face that looked too much like his own. As the wind moved across the open fields, Daniel understood something clearly. The ranch had a past that was not finished, and whatever truth was hidden in that past was slowly rising to the surface.